Okay. So let's for a minute just talk about where we are at the moment in the class. So we've gone through infancy, getting up into the toddler years, starting with the 2 years. So we've basically went from about 0 to about 24 months of development. And you'll note that it took us how many weeks? Almost 6 out of our 8 weeks together so far. And so we'll start speeding a few things up. But now the question becomes is when does childhood and adolescence begin? Because that will be kind of where we're headed. And why is early childhood separated from late childhood? Um, so if any of you are in the early childhood education field, you'll know that early childhood education goes from 0 to 8 years of age. Okay. While most of the focus focuses on 0 through preschool and kindergarten, technically early childhood education goes from 0 to 8. And the question becomes, why is the age of 8 kind of that cutoff? And just to give you some information, this is where we're going. So we're going to start from 2 and we're going to go up to the age of 8. Okay. Well, there are some reasons. It's not really an arbitrary reason, but it is based on research done here, specifically on children here in the United States and in Europe. So I want to make that very clear is that right around 8, there's been a term that has been used in the last, couple decades about the tween years, TWEEN, that is just right before the before adolescence. Okay. And that the idea of the tween years, which really starts around the age of 8, is this misconception about puberty. uh, a lot of in our lay culture and everything, there's this assumption that puberty is this one and done deal, that once a female goes through her first cycle and men start to develop their um, 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 secondary physical characteristics, and same with young girls starting to get their second sexual characteristics, that's puberty. So it's a very shortened period of time. But in reality, puberty is a several year. It's about a 3 to 4 year process. And here in the United States and in the European countries, that process starts at around the age of 8 and then ends around 11, 12 years of age. Okay. And because of that, because hormonal changes and developmental changes start at that age, we consider 8 years old to the first menstrual cycle and secondary sex characteristics developed as late childhood. Okay. Because we do see some marked difference between the 0 to 8 children versus the 8 to 11 children. And probably one of the most predominant one is, for the most part, children in early childhood are what we call androgynous. That really, if you took for example, a 4-year-old boy and a 4-year-old girl, gave them the same exact haircut and dressed them the same, and didn't allow them to do any mannerisms, as you would say, you would have a difficult time determining which one is a boy and which one is a girl, because technically we're androgynous up until starting around the age of 8 when we start getting those secondary sex characteristics. But culture influences the differentiation between girls and boys, as we will see in these lectures, that determine how we can identify which young kids are boys and which young kids are girls. And as we'll note, things get complicated when it comes to gender and early childhood, which we'll talk about a little bit as well. So that's kind of why we're kind of dividing these two groups. mainly because when we get into late childhood, we really need to start about, we got to start talking about a transitionary period. Just like why we divide infancy and early childhood, because that 24 to 36 months is a transitionary period between becoming dependent for food, nutrition, warmth, and those things, and becoming independent, being able to feed oneself, warm oneself, potty training and all those types of things. I'm not thinking clearly today. And so this is kind of, again, we're talking about that transitionary periods, and that's why we have these divisions between these. So, but let's talk about, again, about physical development, okay? And the first probably good place to start is body growth, okay? Because one of the things that we do know is that physical growth slows down in early childhood. So we see a marked slowing of growth uh, from infancy, where we saw um, I can't remember what we said in this class. There's almost like a tripling of infant size, even from 0 to 1 years of age, and then even more from the age of 1 to 2. The thing that does change dramatically is the bone and leg structure, is that we do see rapid growth, for example, in the leg area and in arms. And so we're starting to grow within height. Um, and we also start to see the development of gross and fine motor skills. And so, for example, children are starting to be able to walk independently, carry objects to another place. And so those are some of those gross muscle skills. They're able to start doing more active type of play and those types of things. But we also start to see the development of fine motor skills. Um, and so again, this is that proximodial to principle. So the fine motor skills start with being able to, for example, control shoulders, then elbows, and then fingers and hands. Okay. Same with our legs. Our ability to use our legs to walk and everything start, but we trip very easily. If you'll notice an infant learning how to walk, they do good on their gross movements, but those fine-tuned moments, such as walking upstairs or going downstairs, takes a little while for them because it requires more fine motor skills within the feet area of the body. Okay. Um, and I should note that, again, I'll go back to any of our early childhood education providers or future ones, or even when we talk about parenting in general, we see across cultures that there's this parenting strategy to help children refine their fine motor skills while their gross motor skills. So, for example, we can look at individuals, children being raised in rural Africa, where their mothers use sticks, for example, to learn to teach the child how to use it as a tool. And it really looks from a Western perspective, kind of it doesn't make sense if you just view that from an outside Western perspective. But when you start to understand what that parent is trying to teach that child, then it becomes very clear. Here in the United States, we work with children. I was at the Tucson Book Fair this weekend at U of A, and at one of the activities, they were using scissors um, that were specially made to help a child fine-tune their fine motor skills. And then they also had this sticker activity where the sticker was actually very small. It was about a 1 inch by 1 inch piece of paper that the child could draw anything they wanted on. the purpose of that small 1 inch by 1 inch paper was to kind of help the child learn how to control their fine motor skills. So we see that we see this interaction again between the child's world, the parenting family influence, the educational influence, and the physical development of these skills that the children is learning. And that's why we need to make sure that we understand the idea of, for example, the social aspect, those cognitive aspects, and those physical aspects all work in congruency with each other. We do know that we can see this is when we see a lot of the, for example, developmental disorders, specifically to developmental physical disorders. We can see delay in reaching motor milestones. And we know that these can be improved with physical education and daily exercise. So when we do see children who have motor skill deficits, they are very easily corrected if they are caught at at the earliest stage possible. The longer these delays are ignored or not treated, the harder it is going to be for that child to catch up to those milestones. Okay. And this kind of shows kind of the growth index. And this is based on the body mass index, the BMI. And again, I just want to bring this out. This is based upon children in a Western world. And the reason why I emphasize this point is that we see this differentiated between cultures. So different cultures have a different trajectory. But what we see in all cultures is that we see that during our early childhood years, so we have, this one goes to 10, but we're talking about 8 here. And then we're talking about the infancy years here. And you will notice that the general trend, even among children who are in this higher area, that BMI tends to go down during the early childhood years. Okay. And that's a general trend. And the thing that we get concerned with is when the BMI, so you see here at the end of infancy is when it starts to go down, is when either the BMI flatlines or the BMI continues to grow. Or conversely, if the BMI goes down dramatically, okay? But the thing that I want to focus on here is it's very normal for children in the early childhood years to lose their baby fat that they had before. And two, to lose some mass and then start to grow it again when they get into more of the later early childhood years. And then, of course, as you can see, going into the teen years and young adult years, it steadily goes up. Okay. So based on this, and again, remember around 24 months is then when we start doing that theory of mind and we start recognizing that I have my own body, my own me, other people have their own body and their own me, and we start to do the social comparison. Why is that kid skinnier than me? Why is that kid bigger than me? Why does that kid have different facial structures versus mine? Okay. And then what we do, even in this early childhood years, is we look to, for example, adults and other children and the attention other children get based upon their physical appearance. Okay. And this requires what is called proprioception. And this starts to develop early in childhood, around 24 months. And this is our awareness of our body's position in space. So our ability to recognize where we are in both time and in the position of the world that we're in relation to objects and other people. Okay. If you want to think about it this way, it's our ability to see things in 3D, and where they are distance-wise. Okay. So this plus that theory of mind and the way we start to see children, we do see the start of self-awareness of body image. Okay. And we also see this, and I just don't want to put this in comparison purposes, but we can also see this with parents. So parents saying, "Oh, that baby's cute," or "Geez, can you maybe be more active?" Or you need to. They look at images and they start to compare what their parents' preference is compared to them. Okay. And this is where we actually do see the beginnings, the beginning phases of a lot of, for example, eating disorders. And this is a lot of individuals who study, for example, anorexia and bulimia can really trace the beginnings of those disorders to these early childhood years, starting around 36 months of age. Okay. Um, and then we do know that children have a sense of what we call sexuality. Okay. This is a natural exploration of the human body. I do want to stop here for a minute. It is natural for children to touch certain parts of their body. And I think I talked about this when we were talking about Freudian theory. Um, and they're doing it because it feels good. Okay. But the other reason they explore their own body is that they're noticing differences between their body and other children's bodies, even if it's not in a um, um, co-gender situation. Okay. And they wonder why their body is the same or different than some other children. Okay. Um, and as I noted within the Freudian component when I was talking about this, it's important to understand the difference between a child touching themselves because it feels good versus adult sexuality. And of course, if you ask the child why they're touching their private part, if it has to do with fantasy about another individual, that's a big red flag, versus because it feels good, mom, or feels good, dad. Okay. Um, Now there's been a lot of debate about when parents should start talking about sexuality and how they should be talking about sexuality. And I will say that there has been a couple meta-analysis that has been done. Okay. A meta-analysis is when you take all the research on a given topic and you statistically smush it together to see if there's an effect. Okay. And what these meta-analyses have shown, pushing all of this research together, is that the earlier a parent talks to a child about sexuality, the later the child will enter into sexual activity in adolescence and adulthood. The earlier a parent talks to a child about sexuality, the less likely they will, for example, have a teen pregnancy. They will enter into high risk sexual behaviors in adolescence and do those types of things. So there is this association between when a parent starts engaging a child in conversation and when that child will actually become sexually active, and the probability of things like teen pregnancy and those kinds of things. And that seems counterintuitive, right? And so what are the psychological mechanisms that are at play? Because the counterintuitive part of this is if you don't talk about it, it won't happen, right? So if the child doesn't know about it, then they won't engage in that behavior. But that's the problem, is that if a child doesn't know about it, they'll go learn it from somewhere. Because one of the natural curiosities when we go through adolescence and especially through puberty is why Am I becoming aroused when I look at certain people and certain body images and everything else? And they themselves, because it hasn't been explained to them, will go explore that on their own. Okay. And so this is why, again, this association between when we start having conversations really does determine the adolescence outcome as far as things like teen pregnancy, high risk behaviors, and when a child will start entering into sexual activity. In fact, an interesting study showed that parents who talked to as children as young as 3-year-olds um, uh, statistically significantly didn't enter into sexual activities until after the age of 18. So it's kind of an interesting and sometimes counterintuitive because of our American attitude towards sexuality and whatnot. So just something to think about when you think about your child and when you catch them in their moment. The other thing that I would say in this moment too is and this is going to be kind of a soapbox moment, is make sure you give your child the actual name for their body part. Okay. So a penis is a penis, and that's what it should be named. It shouldn't be named your special part or something like this. And I'll give a very clear example of when I worked with children who have been sexually abused. If you trigger to this, please step away for a minute. I understand that this can be a sensitive subject for a lot of individuals. So I worked with a young child. She was, I believe, 5 at the time, because she was in kindergarten, so she was 5, 6 years old. Um, and her mom just got divorced, and so mom had to end up going and getting work and whatnot, and so she started to have her well what the child would be the child's aunt and uncle pick up the child from school until mom got off work. And a few weeks into it, the school started to notice that the child's performance was starting to go down. She was becoming kind of despondent in the classroom and very quiet. Um, and at some point she started to kind of act out in some type of an aggressive way. And so they brought the mom in and said, "Hey, what's going on?" And the mom said, "Well, we just went through a divorce and whatnot." But the mom decided to have a conversation with the child. And the child was kind of like, "Well, I don't like going to the uncle and aunt's house." And mom asked why. And she goes, "Well, Uncle Tom, we'll call him Tom, puts his hands in my pocket." And mom, assuming that, this is the North coat, so putting his hands in her pockets in the coat and maybe taking her stuff or whatnot. And she goes, "Well, that shouldn't be anything to worry about." But then the child kept coming home. "Mom, he's putting his hands in my pocket and my hands in his pocket." And finally, one day the child was bathing and the mom was leaving the bathroom, and she happened to say, and we'll call her Annie, just a random name, or Anne, "And make sure you wash your pockets really good." And she had this light bulb moment that she had named her daughter's private parts pockets. Um, and realizing that that's what the uncle was using to manipulate the child. Um, and I will tell you, this is not a limited experience. I will tell you that every offender that has offended a child has used the parents' cute names for their private parts in order to entice them and to hurt them. Okay. And so, just on another note, please, when you start talking to your children about these things, name their private parts for what their private parts are, and don't give them the cutesy names, because I promise that someone might catch on to that and harm the child. Okay. Um, so back to our topic, I just wanted to hit on that for just a few minutes before we move on. So we know that that occurs and the body awareness occurs. So these are the basis of things like uh, uh, issues that can happen with a child when they start to develop if the development is in a negative perspective. Okay. So this one needs to be updated, but the trends are still very much the same. And so what about changes or causes to child death or accidental injury? So um, we can see that for the most part, and again, I got to update these numbers, but the trends are the same. I just want to repeat that. Things like motor vehicle deaths, falls, fire and burns, drownings are all trending downward, meaning that they're going downward and they're being reduced. You know, almost motor vehicle accidents, there's even less than that today. Okay. The ones that are on the increase are things like suffocation and poisoning. Okay. Now the question becomes, why is it that there's some that are trending down and then there's others who are trending upward when it comes to at least these physical injuries? And the biggest reason is things like policy and laws. Okay. So, for example, motor vehicle safety um, has greatly increased. If you look at playgrounds, I don't know how old you all are, but playgrounds today are very much different than playgrounds when I was a kid. In fact, in a lot of playgrounds, things like swings are starting to be taken out of playgrounds. And so we know that the policies behind child safety when it comes to physical activity outdoors has done a lot. Fire safety has been these two, the drowning and fire safety are really big social programs. So, you know, for example, in Tucson, they have every spring they have the swimming safety things that are all over the news and are promoted, swimming lessons and how to make sure your pool is safe. And of course, we do a lot with policies around fire and burning. So, for example, if you're renting, your renter is supposed to have at least two fire alarms per square feet of the apartment, those types of things. So, there's areas that we have done really good with, but things like cleaners and whatnot are not heavily regulated. There's not a lot of information out there, and things like suffocation and parent knowledge about how to make sure their child is sleeping right, how much blankets and stuff should be in a bassinet. These are areas that we still have a lot of improvement to do on. So now these are physical injuries, and I just want to bring that up. Now we will talk about physical abuse and sexual abuse that are physical, but these really have to do with the interaction of the child and their world. Okay. And so when we talk about abuse, even though they're physical, we'll see that they're differentiated because these are more things that are due to a child's actions rather than or the actions of a physical thing like a motor vehicle versus the actions of, for example, a parent. Okay. So again, this comes from the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. Now, I am going to fully admit when this study was began and well into it, I was very skeptical. I was probably one of the skeptics of the results of these studies because how can these experiences define some individuals' lives? How can that be? Okay. And and as a psychologist at the time, I had a hard time with that. But as the study has gone on, and it has been replicated, and other researchers have replicated this study, the findings of the adverse childhood experience studies are just about now. You got to remember, human behavior is much diverse than global temperatures, but the consistency of replication of these studies are just about as consistent as the replication of the global warming studies. So this has become a very significant thing to understand, okay? But when we look at participants who did this study, what is the prevalence rate of these different types of abuse and neglect? Okay, and we'll find that the two top types of abuse tend to be physical and sexual abuse. And we'll see here in a minute, but when it comes to reporting, we'll see that physical and emotional neglect are going to kind of flip this. But when individuals are able to, in a confidential, anonymous way, we find that individuals report higher rates of physical and sexual abuse rather than physical and emotional neglect. Okay. And then emotional abuse is kind of that in between one. Okay. So let's go through these really quick as what they're defined as. Physical abuse is, of course, any type of physical harm to the child. In the beginning of this study, I will say that it didn't include things like spanking to the point of injury, but in later studies it did. And again, I emphasize spanking to the point of injury. Okay. Sexual abuse is any type of sexual contact with a child, from fondling to penetration. Um, and emotional abuse really has to do with um, um, I want to say valuing of the child, but it also has to do with holding the ability for a child to emotionally develop and grow in a proper way. So, emotional abuse includes things like not allowing a child to go to preschool or to kindergarten or to school, as an example, limiting them from who they interact with as far as play. Okay. And then, of course, physical neglect is not meeting the child's needs, food, water, shelter, warmth, all of those kinds of things. Emotional neglect is withholding emotional needs of a child, not meeting those emotional needs. Okay. Now, how does, for example, the United States compare to um, other nations? While we will say of the 26 modern countries, the United States, China, and Britain have the worst records of child welfare and abuse. Okay, meaning these three countries have higher child welfare and abuse cases compared to those other 26 modern countries. 26 modern countries mean that they're industrialized and they're within the technology era of the world. So they have things like internet and transportation and those types of things, cell phones and smartphones and those types of things. And they have they have education systems, I should say that. So we're not doing very well on that end. If we compare ourselves with second and third world countries, the United States does okay. But the question we have to ask is should we be comparing ourselves to countries like Mexico, countries in South America, South Africa, as far as these countries are concerned versus, for example, Denmark, Sweden, Germany, Italy. And I will actually say on this end, lately, and I should probably take this out of the slide. Mexico, education-wise, is actually doing better than we are. And there's some markers of child welfare and abuse that they will probably become within those 26 modern countries who have less child welfare and abuse issues than we do have here in the United States. And so I've been thinking about actually taking that out of this slide and maybe putting South America and South and Western Africa into these more second, third world examples. So Carolina, she asked, what about verbal abuse? Verbal abuse is within the domain of emotional abuse. So it's the belittling of a child. It's that type of abuse. So verbal abuse is coupled within emotional abuse. That's a really good question, because I know you can emotionally abuse a child without verbally abusing a child, but verbal abuse is considered a subcategory. So at least within the taxonomy. But you will see some research that does separate the two. All right. Now, so why is it that we're doing so poorly with child welfare and whatnot here in the United States? Well, there's approximately about 6.3 million reports of child abuse reported per year. Of those, only about half are investigated. Okay. So here in the United States, a report of child abuse, and when I say a report, I mean a report that is, how should I put it? Not assumptive. Okay, so it's not grandma and grandpa calling and saying, "Well, I heard my son yell at my grandchild, and so I think there's abuse," or a neighbor calling saying, "Hey, I heard the neighbor yell at their child." No, these reports, the 6.3 million reports, are reports that should have been investigated. So I just want to make this point. These are not reports that are just not don't have some substantial issue with them, okay? But only half of those substantial reports are investigated. Of these half, you'll notice that the statistics are switched from when we talked about the study that I just went over was. So in these, we have about 78.3 are due to neglect. 18.3 are due to physical abuse, and then 9.3 are sexual abuse, and then 8.5. Now, um, I do want to make this point, when it comes to child abuse and reporting child abuse, emotional abuse, and even verbal abuse, unless there is a physical threat, are not considered as in law an abuse. And that's very hard to deal with when I worked in the field, because those types of abuses actually had a more long-term effect than things like physical abuse. And so it's something that in the legal area we grapple with. But there is something called psychological maltreatment, and at least we're kind of getting into some of those emotional neglect and abuse areas. Psychological maltreatment is that subcategory of emotional abuse and emotional neglect that includes withholding a child from educational opportunities. Um, and so this is one of those subcategories that at least has some legal precedence to be reported. Okay. And then about 10.6% experienced some other type of maltreatment, whether it was nutrition maltreatment, withholding warming clothes. So back when, again, I'll come to my Idaho, Montana experience, parents in sub-zero degree weather sending their children to school without a coat. Those types of maltreatments. Or here in Arizona, having the child, go outside and play in 120 degrees without preparing them, hydrating, and all those kinds of things. Um, okay, so I want to try and explain this. So this is the estimated. So when we talk about maltreatment, so we're talking about things like neglect, not meeting the child's needs. This is what we call the fatality rates. How much child maltreatment results in a child passing away. Okay. And we can see that 2008 to 2009 are the highest years. And again, I need to update this statistic, is that we can see that this trend is heading upwards. So when we look at 2020, I believe we're up to about 4.6, 4.7 per, I think this is per 100,000. That's usually how they estimate these. And so we're trending back upward. And so these are some things to consider. So why is it that we're starting to see more and more child maltreatment? And what was it about 2007 to 2008 that probably we see the highest years, at least within this 12-year period, that there were these high rates of child maltreatment? And if we look at probably the main reason is, I think they call it the Great Recession of 2008, where it started in 2007, where there was a lot of people losing jobs, losing their houses, losing all of their resources. And so this is definitely an example of a social economic process that probably increased these rates of maltreatment due to that recession year of 2008. Okay. And then we see, for example, recovery plans that were implemented in these years, and we see that reduction going almost back to a baseline. But then again, in 2012, we start to see these increase again. Okay. So this is just an example of how economics and whatnot can play a role, and especially when it comes to fatalities based on child maltreatment. Okay. So when we talk about what are the risk factors about a child being abused. So, what are the number one predictors? And a lot of people will go, well, it's parents who are angry, or parents who are economically deprived, or it's something like that. But when we really get down to it, we can separate mother versus father factors, and then both mother and father factors. So the number one predictor when it comes to a mother, and you would think that it was caretaking ability, well, actually, it kind of is in a sense, is that the biggest risk factor for a child being born is at the time of the child's birth, the mom is between the age of 18 to 23. This is the number one predictor. Now, there's other factors with mothers that can play a role. This is the number one factor. Okay. Now, what is it about 18 to 23? Well, some of it has to do with maturity level, those types of things, preparation to become a parent, and economic stability, right? Those could all play a factor. But there has actually been some really interesting programs. If anyone has ever heard Parents as Teachers programs, those types of things aim specifically at this age group. And so I'm going to bring up some Hawaii studies, and I thought these were brilliant. Is For several years, Hawaii had the highest child abuse rates in the nation, and they were almost becoming out of control. And so what they did is started what's called a nurse visiting program. And so for any child that was born between the age of 18 to about 20, I think they did 21, 22, they would have a nurse visitor for the first, I think, 12 to 24 months of the child's development. And the purpose, the kind of the um, uh, out outward appearance of the program is that the nurse was going to come and, make sure the child is healthy, physically developing, all those kinds of things. The back part of it is the nurse was trained into teaching the mother parenting skills. Okay. And so they did this program over a 12-year period. And at the end of that 12-year period, Hawaii actually had one of the lowest child abuse rates in the nation. But again, the unfortunate part about this is that these programs are very expensive, and so they did do away with them. But they haven't gone to the highest level, but their child abuse rates have creeped up at least around the nation's average and whatnot. So that's the unfortunate part, is these are very expensive programs. But it's an example of what can happen if we had intervention, at least on the mother side of the equation. On the father side, the biggest risk factor is an absentee father. So this is a father who's either completely not involved in the child's life physically, but this can also include a father who does not at all engage in the fathering role. So this can be the guy who ignores, who puts all the responsibility on the mother. Um, um, I think of this when I was again at that book store thing, and I saw all the moms pushing the cart while the dad was just kind of there freely walking. And I'm like, I wonder how often he pushes the cart. And thinking about this lecture that I was going to give today, I was kind of wondering, wow, is that an example of what we do today? Now, I shouldn't make a judgment call based on a few minutes of observation, but that's kind of the idea, is the father is just not there, even though he might live there or be in a relationship with mom. And so there's this continuum of a father either not being there at all physically and emotionally and psychologically, or a father that's there but is absent psychologically and emotionally. Okay. And then there's a prolifera. I didn't say that right, and I'll end our conversation with this today, of factors of both mother and father, okay, that tend to Crystal, yeah, so that's a good example when we talk about alienation. So that's a good example of a father becoming absent. But we can even, starting, in our more modern times, and whatnot, we can see mothers can alienate a child, and we're finding that has, not that will result in abuse, but it does have a negative effect on the child. So again, when we get to that assessment, you'll see that is one of the risk factors. And when we look at when a child goes through puberty, for example, this is a good example of alienation. Is that one of the predictors of when a child will go through puberty is an unemotionally available mother. Okay. So a mother who's kind of either physically or emotionally or psychologically has alienated their child. So while on the mother's end, alienation might not result in abuse, it still has effect even on physical development. Of course, alienation, which is a good definition of absentee father, that does predict abuse, if that makes sense. Okay. So, what are some things about fathers and mothers? And I'm going to talk about this in two contexts. P Parents who are co-parenting, so they're separated, but they still parent together, versus parents who are together and are married, let's say. Okay. The first one is the stability of relationships. So, for example, in the co-parenting situation, mom and dad aren't jumping from intimate relationship to intimate relationship to intimate relationship. In the the parents who are together, one parent constantly leaving and coming back is an example of stability of relationship. Toxicity of relationship. of relationships. So this one is in the co-parent area. And we'll define toxicity when we get to young adulthood and relationships. But toxicity is just where two people are just wrong for each other, and they create constant negativity in the relationship. Okay. So again, when we're talking about parents who are just co-parenting, are they in healthy separate relationships? And we can also talk about when they are in a relationship or are married, is the mother and father, even though they're married, toxic for each other? And this is where we do get into the domain of things. On one end, domestic violence. On the other end, it's just two people that are just really unhealthy for each other. So we mentioned stability of relationship, but we also have to mention stability of situation. And so this is where we do bring up there is a high rate of child abuse among military families. And one of those predictors of abuse in military families is how many times the person is transferred. Now, with that being said, um, within the military, those families who are not at risk are those families who try to, even though the military personnel is transferred, they try to set up a similar environment at the new location. Okay, and that's what's meant by stability of situation is what do you do to make sure the child has a consistent environment from transition to transition? Okay. Parents' response to stress and change um, um, has to deal with it. So do the parents have a negative response when something changes, such as economic ability and stuff? How do they react to it? Do they cope with it? And this really has to do with coping skills with life. Educational level, and I'm going to say that this is a correlation, regression analysis. Um, And this also has to deal with child abuse and not relationship abuse, is as we see education level go up, we see child abuse rates go down. Okay. However, that doesn't mean that, this factor doesn't play a role. Okay. Because this is independent of this relationship, because we see that education level does not predict things like relationship violence, domestic violence, those types of things. View of being a parent, okay? Does the person actually want to be a parent? Their attitudes towards emotion and actual behaviors are important. So does the parent have a positive view or a negative view of being a parent? And that goes back to that example when we went to Erickson's between um, trust versus mistrust. And if you remember that mom, the example on the mistrust just really wasn't wanted that child to be there. Okay. All right. We're almost out of time, and I want to leave some time for questions.